Unfortunately, when it went national, the FAA made it punitive and it really didn't work as well. So SAFE picked it up and we marketed it as CFI Pro, but it's very much the same curriculum and is covering things which really don't get covered in the initial FAA training. And especially now, we know that with the airlines hiring at incredible rates, there's a real pressure for people to move through those ratings quickly. We find when we examine CFIs that usually the average CFI coming through one of these academies has only 10 hours of real solo. They have the absolute minimum from the private pilot level. Everything in the commercial instrument was flown, performing the duties of pilot in command. And I got to tell you, that was a very big change, perhaps not the most wise thing on the part of the FAA. When I talk with ASIs in a FSDO or even people in 600 and 800, they're not aware that this performing the duties of PIC even exists. They're still remembering their training where they did a long commercial cross-country solo. So we're not really building the same kinds of pilots, and that results in a little less broad-based experience for CFIs who are teaching. If you're having a member of your family take flying, it could be somebody that has 10 hours of solo. And what exactly are they sharing? So CFI Pro is intended to provide the missing manual, as we call it. First webinar, we covered this, which is everyone who is a pilot has certain personality traits, and a lot of them are, and I think right here, yeah, pilot personality. And if you guys stick around to the end and do the questions, I'll send this extra sheet that has all these extra resources. But I didn't emphasize this in the very first webinar, but we all know pilots are different kinds of people. And it's not always because of the training. A lot of it is self-selection. People who become pilots are people who really like challenge, people who really like adventure. They're pretty hard chargers. They really are competitive, suspicious. They have trust issues, low tolerance for imperfection. All of these are, if you could shoot that QR, it would take you to the page that has all this analysis. And there's even a fun little quiz you can do with your significant other. And you'll laugh when you see it, because even though you deny it, you have a lot of these traits. And so when you try to switch over and become the compassionate coach, it's quite a transformation. You really do have to develop some emotional intelligence. The survey from the AOPA that Flight Training Experience in 2010, what they discovered with extensive analysis of people in training was that the number one reason people leave flight training were the inexperienced CFIs that didn't seem to care or were unprepared or late, unorganized. The reason that people stayed was because they had a really good CFI who really paid attention and cared. So we know that this is really the secret sauce in flight training of why people stick and learn and continue. But it does require on the part of everybody that becomes a CFI this transformation from impatient and perfectionist to a compassionate coach. And it's not easy and it's not trained. I hope you guys all know that the recent CFI ACS came out last Monday. And I did a search of that document. I searched for patience, compassion, and I didn't find any of those things mentioned. In other words, what the FAA trains in initial certification is they train a commercial pilot to fly safely in the right seat and to educate in terms of talking and providing lesson plans. But they really don't cover the human aspects of it, the secret sauce, we call it, that really makes people effective. The other parts of this missing manual, as we call it, are the fact that a lot of the skills that people are shown to get ready for the practical test are actually counterproductive when they get into the field to be a CFI. In other words, if you think back to when you were a CFI, just got your certificate, and think of how you flew that test. You handled the controls continuously. You talk, and that's what they want you to do, and that's what you're trained to do, and you pass the test. But as you know now from experience, and I think we saw 72% of you are CFIs. As we know now, that's not the effective method of educating a new learner. And so, what we need to get through to these new CFIs are some of those concepts. The second webinar, we covered flight training fallacies, and there were 6 of them. Basically, the big one that I put a lot of emphasis on, and these are available if you look in the chat, it's just YouTube/Safe Pilots. You can look at it. Teaching in final form. And we mentioned the fact that when you go to an airport, and you're just like me, I'm sure you watch the landings happening, and people are just slamming those planes onto the runway, learning to land. And the problem is really that they don't have control of the basics. There's a lot of elements that have to be mastered before they can make a successful landing. By the time a learner is doing landings, they've probably been through every one of the required private pilot elements and areas of operation, except navigation, night flying, and maybe, well, they've got a little bit of instrument, but probably not as much as they need for cross country. But they've had all that training. They just haven't mastered it. So we're putting the pieces together tonight, and we're going to talk about that part. We're going to talk about incremental mastery so that people aren't training in final form. The other 6 fallacies, the other 5 were practice makes perfect. The second one, the next one was the idea that intrinsically motivating, that flight training is fun, that people, really get off on the training part of it. And it's easy to forget how much of a struggle it is to really work your way through that training. Plateaus, the problems with motivation, scheduling, and especially now, just about always people are on a waiting list. I'm in St. Augustine tonight. I did my jet recurrent down in Tampa, and I drove up here to do 2 or 3 flight tests. The one woman has been waiting for a flight test since August. It's just incredible how the backlog, and I mean, talk about frustration. It's things that people of our generation, if you've been a CFI for a while, we never experienced. It's out of control. So anyway, this second webinar is in the YouTube there. This, if you can shoot this QR, it will take you to that personality test. I forgot that I added that in there. So I'll leave that up for just a second. You'll have a lot of fun with that. And like I say, if you stick around to the end and you answer the 5 questions for your master FAA Wings credit, I will send you all of this extra stuff. It's the motivator to get you to the end of the webinar. Okay, and moving along, there's another common misconception, which this is again from the feedback from the audience, people wrote me mails, is the curse of expertise. There is a misconception that to be a really good CFI, you have to be a really good pilot. And that just doesn't really translate. In fact, there's almost an inverse correlation to that. People who are very, very good with the controls and piloting often end up being some of the worst instructors because of several factors. And you can read this blog and it will translate all that for you. Chuck Yeager, golden hands. The man is a legend, right? Bob Hoover probably would be a much better instructor, but frequently when people are very talented in an area, they cannot deconstruct it and break it into pieces. And they can't, they never struggled through it, and there's a lack of compassion. So it's called the curse of expertise. Sometimes the best people to have as an instructor is someone who's, competent, but not the ace of the base, because they struggled too, where you're going to struggle. So CFI, it isn't all as obvious as you would think. There's a little quick review of the 6 flight training fallacies. And we have one more, actually. When putting this together tonight, I developed a 7th one. But the other part of successful training to move forward into incremental mastery is called the learning zone. And what we emphasized in that webinar was that it takes the elements that we mentioned for the CFI, the compassion, the empathy, the communication, but it also takes on the part of the person who's learning. They have to be curious and motivated, and they have to have a trusting environment. If there's not a basis of honesty and trust between the person who's educating and the learner, there's going to be a lot of excuses. There's going to be a lot of recriminations. There's going to be tension. The learning zone has to be like a safe place where there's, and Meg Godlewski writes great articles, but she just wrote one about how errors are expected in flight training. And if you're an experienced CFI, you should expect that this would happen at this point. I mean, and learners tend to make excuses, and it's the most counterproductive way of taking training. You just have to understand on both sides of that equation that someone who is beginning in any field knows nothing. They're a stumbling baby in this world of aviation. And we're going to emphasize in the incremental mastery section of this that you have to kind of back up and look at what we are expecting. It's kind of amazing that we're going to take a terrestrial hominid and we're going to make them into a flyer in 40 hours or 50 hours, 60 or even 70 hours, say 2 weeks of full-time work, and somebody is going to be a competent pilot. That's a huge expectation. That's a huge amount of pressure on a person. And when you get to the incremental mastery part, you'll see this wall that says impossible. Well, how do we enable them to climb that and to become a pilot? That's the real challenge. And I hate to say it, but for the most part, we're failing because, we still have a pretty phenomenal dropout rate. And to a large extent, I'd have to say at this point, and I don't know if I added that slide, we're not making pilots at the same level that we were. What we've done is we've kind of lowered the bar rather than raised and elevated the expectations. So very important to maintain standards. Here's the diagram. And as most diagrams that David makes, I've made it a little too complicated. In the background is that word impossible, and you can see the person standing in front of it. And people come into this with expectations, motivation, curiosity. The CFI has to kind of be that compassionate coach that says, you can do this a step at a time and we can get over that wall and become a pilot. Let's back up to where the very first exposure comes, a discovery flight, and people get in the plane, and of course they're steering it with the yoke, and they're going to be completely a klutz. But what we have to emphasize from the very first time somebody gets in an aircraft with us is that every time they get out of that aircraft, they have more knowledge, more skill, and they've made a step forward. And all incremental mastery is turning the parts that they've succeeded at over to them and making it very visible to them that they have succeeded and made that step. It's a very, very big climb to get to solo. And that's where most people drop out, is somewhere before solo, because of all of these historic expectations. And that goes back to the flight training fallacies. A lot of those fallacies came from civilian aviation training, World War II, 8, 10, 12-hour solos. It should not be emphasized that the solo has to happen at any particular point, because every learner is going to be different. And many schools now are backing it up quite a way for just safety and confidence. If you are pushing someone so hard that you're in the pattern, banging landings on, and it's very apparent to anyone watching that the airspeed control's not there, the tracking's not there, the configuration might not even be correct, and these people are into pattern landing, they're being rushed way too fast through that. In the last questions that we supplied for this was kind of embarrassing, because the questions at the end of this are not just for you, it's so you can get your credit for FAA wings, but also it's my grade as to how well I did. And there were about 5 people in the questions last time that said fear was an important motivator for students. And I wrote back on all of those, obviously. And I immediately wrote a blog, which is still up. You can check it out. But fear poisons any effective learning. Fear and stress are poison to the learning environment. If a person is in that state of mind, they're just absolutely shut down with all the higher level cognitive functions. They've gone into survival mode. And we work in a very scary environment. It's probably the worst learning environment we could have. We have all these expectations of people to learn. Now we're putting them in a plane that's confusing, noisy, and scary. And it's amazing anyone gets done. So anyway, in the back there, the second poll was on, remind me again, CFIs and what they're.
The personality qualities of your best CFI.
Okay. So we'll, I'm sorry, as a typical CFI, I'm going way too far too fast. Anyway, our goal when we make pilots should be more than what you see here. The certification standards, and I emphasize this in every seminar, and I think I mentioned it in the first two. When we have the airman certification standards for any level, it means that somebody has gotten a 70% if they pass. That's just not enough. When you do an evaluation and somebody is just mediocre on everything, they're going to get a pilot certificate. They could have 70% on the knowledge test, and I got one tomorrow, has a 72 on the knowledge test. Russ Still is going to talk at Sun and Fun about this. It's more and more common, and it's not a good trend. Anyway, what we really want to train is fully competent pilot in command, resourceful, resilient. A lot of what we have to do is build courage. We have to build confidence. We have to build also that sort of reflection, and we'll talk about that later, but the part that says, how did I do? And a little humility, because that's what's going to keep somebody safe. But I think I told you that I ran a flying school that was associated with a club, and I did that for 25 years. When we made a pilot, they got the keys and they could go flying. They could take the plane. One guy who I examined and gave him his pilot certificate, he earned it obviously, but he took off the next day and he circumnavigated the United States because he always wanted to do it. It probably wasn't the brightest thing. He did it safely. He learned a lot. But the theory is that when somebody becomes a pilot, they should be capable of piloting. They shouldn't be just at a barely passing, oh, I'm going to get a next rating and move on. And that's what we're seeing now with these academies. We're seeing people who move all the way through. They have 10 hours of solo. They go from a Skyhawk to an Airbus, and they're really only being trained to be a co-pilot. We're doing half the job. We've lowered the expectations. We would get people in our school who graduated from a big academy, and they would come to us to rent our planes. Why were they coming to us to rent our planes? Because their home base airport where they graduated from, they became a pilot. They would not rent them their planes. That's not a very good testimonial as to the quality of your successful applicants. So remember that when you prepare somebody, you should prepare them well in excess of the standards. And there was a raised hand there. Can you put something in the chat there? I see 19 in the chat. Is there something I should be?
Yeah, there was a question from Paul. Maybe the pass rate needs to be raised to 80%.
Yes. I'll tell you how this works, Paul. It's, DPEs, we are legally required by law and the FAA that if somebody meets the standards, they get the certificate. That's just the way it is. The only thing that raises the standard above that is a good CFI that insists on better performance. And it's a joy to fly one of those tests where somebody just defines the standards and it's far in excess of what is expected on that ACS. I just make the point that standards are the minimum. When we do a test like that and somebody's behind the curtain, what DPEs call this is a gray. They call them a gray. They're walking down the line and we just don't know which side of the line the body's going to fall on. They're entitled to a certificate if they meet the standards. And, that's not always a great thing. Anyway, this is exactly what people start out with on the top. And it's not unlike what we start out with in any flight. And I want to make that correlation because we all have expectations, and people start learning to fly. They got sold a bill of goods, they got told it was quick, easy, and cheap. And if we've been in aviation for any amount of time, we know it's not any of those three things. The critical thing when you start, a learner walks in and they say, I want to get my pilot certificate, I want to fly an Airbus, whatever they want to do. You have to make sure we start honest. If we don't start with an honest version of what they're going to encounter, as soon as they get to this reality on the bottom, it's not gonna result in them staying with us. The other thing is, if you think about it in a bigger context, this on the bottom is exactly what we do as pilots. Every trip that we take, we have a plan, we have an expectation, and I still don't think one of the flights that I've taken has met every one of those expectations. There's always flexibility and resilience required. Those are certainly things that a CFI has to prepare somebody for. So we don't want to be blowing smoke. We want to be realistic about this. And we have to use those. If a mag check doesn't work, it's like, well, that's a good lesson. If the weather craps, that's a good lesson. This is what we're dealing with. So not only do we have to be honest, but we have to say to them, this is life. This is what we're working with. This is a blog I wrote, and this is what they seem to say. You start out here, some kind of magic happens, and there you are, Bob Hoover on the other side of it. Not too realistic. When you talk to a pilot at any level, you could not discern which one of these two was the 70% and which one of them was the 98%. It's not going to be apparent on their pilot certificate. If these were two CFIs, the same thing would be true. As Paul said, it'd be great to insist on an 85%. But one of these guys just barely scraped through, and one was just amazing. Both are now pilots. Both passed the test. And that can happen at any level. Very critical to keep that in mind. We also know that, and I think the second poll in there. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. We wrote this blog because there's absolutely kind of shocking things that people don't know once they become a pilot. And what I wrote in a poll, and I want you to answer it quick, is what's the most shocking thing that we don't train pilots to do? And if it's not in the ACS, it's not going to be trained. It's not going to be tested. If we don't test it, CFIs aren't going to teach it. And that would be not the experienced CFIs, but that would be new CFIs that say, okay, I only need the minimum here to get you through. That makes our school look good. That makes our numbers look good. That makes our applicants happy. But it doesn't always lead to a safe outcome. So just write in there the most important pilot skill that's not tested, so it's not trained. I'd like to see if your ideas correspond with mine. Should have that Jeopardy music playing in the background. So on my side of it, and then we'll experiment with what you guys wrote. But one of the shockers for me was somebody leaving one of those academies, and their CFI also probably never used a self-fueling operation. They don't know how to put the credit card in there. So any new pilot coming from academy has a 4-hour endurance, and they're going to run out of gas going west, and they won't know how to put more in the plane. So that's kind of a big fail. If they learned at a non-towered field, they're terrible on the radio when they get to a Delta, Charlie, or Bravo. If they learned at a Delta, Bravo, and Charlie airport, when they go to a non-towered field, they are similarly kind of hopeless. I had a student, not a student, this was a pilot sitting at the end of a non-towered field expecting to get a takeoff clearance. He would have been there all day if I wasn't with him. So these are just kind of humorous but sad testimonies to what can happen in our flight training environment. Okay, so why don't we take a look a few of those, if you would, in the background? What did we see in there? Well, I'll just go on to some of the ones that I'm aware of. One of the ones for me, as a DPE, I never, ever, ever test a crosswind because an applicant is not going to fly on a day when there's more than 5-10 knots of crosswind. I had a CFI candidate recently cancel a flight test because there was a 5-knot crosswind. I was just amazed. So one of my big ones is that, yeah, it's, landings are about 57% of accidents, and most of those involve wind, and crosswinds are not anywhere required. If it says in 6193, you will train crosswinds before cross country, and obviously a great idea. But the level at which people train crosswinds is just not enough. And what SAFE is recommending is just like 10 night landings. Every learner that's going to be put up for a test has 10 crosswind landings. And it doesn't mean they're totally successful with a 10-knot crosswind, but the 10-10 rule is not a bad one. They should go out and at least know what this looks like. This all continues to where we get the CFI, who may or may not have that skill. And as I said, when I was running a school for 25 years, I would get CFI candidates from every different university and academy and program. And we put them through this kind of training to get them to the point where they were effective in the cockpit, because they couldn't do crosswinds because they didn't learn it in private. They didn't learn it in commercial. We
David, I've
recently
got
had.
some. Oh, sorry.
You got
I
some
didn't mean to
answers? You
interrupt
found
you.
them?
I got some answers for you. Yeah.
Yeah, let's hear what
Would
we
you
got.
like me to read some out?
Yes, please.
Okay. The most
Because this
important
is how
pilot
I
skill.
learned.
Most important pilot skill, not tested and therefore not trained. Emotional regulation during stressful situations or task overload. Problem solving for various scenarios, especially those without a straightforward answer. Good judgment, knowing really when not to fly. Aircraft systems knowledge. Fueling an airplane, refueling, how to add oil, weather knowledge and interpretation, also navigation. To think, writing in clear characters. All my students had to learn from me how to write. Air traffic control instructions, judgment, decision making, adaptive to situation, performance parameters, fuel tie down, lots of fuels, etiquette, how to move an airplane with the tow bar. There's a lot of great answers. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And it's funny, all of you guys are onto it. You've got to hang around some of these academies to believe what you see. They call the fuel truck, and the fuel truck fuels the plane. And that's how it works all the way through their training. And they never handled a hose. They don't know how to safely fuel a plane. They certainly don't know how to use a cart operated, pilot controlled operation. We had a young CFI we just hired, and he has absolutely no ability to do mental math at all. If we said you're going 120 knots and we're going so many miles, there's no way, 60 miles, say, there's no way he could figure that out. And the chief instructor that's there now is just beating on this kid. Because I think still, to get into the airlines, there's got to be some standard. But there's so many of these very important skills that aren't listed. You'll notice in the new ACS, the CFI ACS, there's a couple of maneuvers now which SAFE lobbied hard for. I got the AFS 800 guy on speed dial, and I wrote a blog called Invisible Angle of Attack. And I really pushed for secondary stalls, and they finally got into the CFI ACS. It's still not a mandatory area of operation and element, but if you look at it, I think it's section 10B, and it says secondary stalls will be performed and recovered. And, there'll be a complete discussion of angle of attack. And it's so vital that pilots learn that, yes, guess what? You don't have to hold the nose up high in the sky to get it to stall. You have to see a stall with the nose low. Now, let's think about that. Why would they want new CFIs to do secondary stalls if it's not in any of the private or commercial ACSs or PTS? Well, there's no PTSs now at that level. Why would they do that? And the reason is, if you back it up and think about it, is because they want a comprehensive understanding on the part of the CFIs. on the first line, but secondarily, they're telling you that they want that demonstrated in training. It's not going to be tested, but it should be demonstrated. All of these things that we're talking about that aren't taught are things that a really savvy CFI should be exposing their learner to so that they become a comprehensive, resilient, resourceful pilot. Somebody said emotional regulation. That's something I train every pilot when I talk about hyperventilating, and I even bring this into a test once they've passed the 3 questions that we have to give. Pilots can hyperventilate. I think every one of us that's experienced has hit a point in their flying where it's scary as heck and you find yourself starting to breathe faster. You're starting to hyperventilate. You have to know how to emotionally calm yourself. So these are skills that we really should be transmitting. And thank goodness now the FAA has put a few things into the CFI ACS that are saying, why should a CFI be proficient in secondary stalls? So they can demonstrate it to a private or a commercial level student. What about the other one? Now they have minimum controllable airspeed. And this was something that I shouldn't relate a story because I know the head of AFS 800 is actually on the webinar tonight. We had one of our members of SAFE in the ACS committee get invited to leave. He got so emotional about minimum controllable airspeed when they took it out of the private pilot level test. But they put it back into the CFI ACS. And what they're telling you in a backhanded manner is that they want you to be competent at that as a CFI. Why would they do that? Because they want you to demonstrate that to students at the private and commercial level, even though it's not going to be tested. Their backhanded recommendation is that these maneuvers are things that a CFI should be really good at so they can expose their pilots to it. I was just gratified to see him. It was, a best thing. It made my week. I instituted this after I'd been teaching about 10 years, I think, which was everybody who was learning from me and everyone that was in our school was about halfway to solo after they'd mastered the very basics, going to do what we called a half solo. In other words, it was a time for them to demonstrate to themselves as well as their instructor that they had acquired quite a level of proficiency. In other words, if we start them out with legal pilot, legal plane, doing that, as soon as they're mastered that, it becomes their part of the operation. We don't touch that anymore. They assure that the plane is legal. They assure that the weather is going to meet their standards. And of course, we're going to add value to that and nuance, but we want to try to hand over things, but as accurately as possible, so that when somebody becomes master of that area of operation, we as the educator don't monkey with it anymore. That's yours now. They do the startup, they do the ground checks, they do the radio. How many people in the pattern hear the flight instructors talking? That should never happen. In my school, I took the buttons off the right side. I put them up on the dash and I made sure they were red. You can push that button as a CFI when there's a critical moment and safety is being jeopardized. Otherwise, the pilot, the learner, has to be the one that's transmitting so they learn how to do it. We get to the test as DPEs and we see these people who obviously have been tied to the apron strings. And that's not motivational either. It's first of all, they're never going to develop the competence and skill, but second of all, the confidence. So the real thing behind incremental mastery is not the building blocks sort of steps you heard about in the FOI. It's the psychological part of acquiring the courage, proficiency, command authority to say, I'm in charge. When you take somebody and you say, you're going to drive me out to the practice area 3,500 all by yourselves, I'm just going to sit here with my arms folded, you're going to do it all. They're a little scared. And when they accomplish that and prove to themselves that they've acquired all that skill, It's a huge motivational boost. It really gets them going. And that is the point then where we start to introduce most of the scary stuff, the emergencies, the stalls. We really want to give them a boost before we move on to some of those more challenging events. We want to make sure that they're comfortable in the plane. But this procedure works all the way through training. It works at the private pilot level. It works through instrument. I hope all of you guys are taking your students into the clouds and getting them some wet wing time. To me, it is almost incomprehensible that there would be an ATP pilot that has never been in a cloud, but it's physically possible. It happens. You did all your training in Phoenix. They desperately want to get a cloud, but it doesn't always happen. So we have to really watch that we don't create dependency, that we make confident lifetime learners. This other poll, which I didn't get to, and I'll ask you guys to answer it now. This is sort of one of the things we do in the CFI Pro when we present it at a school or an academy. And it's a very, again, this is the you have to create that mental tension, and you ask people, what is when you were a learner, when you were getting your pilot certificates, everybody hit a plateau and you struggled and you thought, well, maybe I'm not going to be a pilot, maybe I'm not going to make it. Everybody had one of those moments. I'm going to be embarrassed, I'll have to tell everyone I dropped out. But some caring CFI, some person worked through that with you. And this is where I ask, what is the most important personal attribute that made that magic happen? So just think back to when you were struggling as a learner, or maybe, just now getting another rating. What was the thing that really helped you get over that plateau? And we'll give that a little time. And this should be, when we get done with this, it's a list that's probably pretty good for things that you won't see in a flight school, but we should see in a flight school. Some of the emotional intelligence items. Boy, I hope it keeps flashing me. The internet is unstable. I picked a hotel. How do you pick a hotel when you're traveling? And the way I pick a hotel is with the best network connection. I test them all before I book the room. Anyway, why don't we end that? And if you could dig through that in the background and see what we've got, I'd be curious to know.
Sure can do. Hang on one sec.
Thank you. Emotional math, mental, yeah. So as a CFI, yeah, if we're doing it correctly, we're trying to become superfluous. It's a lot like last time I think I mentioned, like parenting. You have to really kind of step out and not hover and, let them make a few mistakes. That's the hardest thing, I think, for new CFIs. When I do CFI testing, it's as soon as you vary an iota, the applicant that's testing to be a CFI grabs the controls and say, my controls. And I guess that's what they're trained to do. But obviously that, again, is something that doesn't work in the real world.
All right, we got some results.
Okay, ready to copy.
Their most important personality trait. I'll list them off. Putting things into real life perspective, specifically landings. Listening to what I was saying, clarifying the issue, then creating a plan to address the problem. Lot of patience here in the answers. Commitment, compassion, consistency, encouragement to continue. Confidence building, mentoring, pep talk assured me this is normal. It helped me immensely. Empathy with the student, making the flight training fun. It's not all about hitting the checklist. This one person said, my private pilot CFI in 1975 told me he'd knock me out if I locked up on the controls. No joke. Maybe that's a what not to do. Understanding how to describe things differently just for you. We talked about that in a previous webinar. Lots of encouragement, understanding, being a good listener.
Yeah,
letting me solve the problems myself, making it fun again.
And I got to say, the fun and the humor part are underemphasized. Once you have that learning zone where there's trust and there's a real relationship between two people, I'm thinking Michael Phillips when he trains, the fact he's training very advanced people, but they're having a great time. I mean, that is so motivating when we're learning, but we're also sharing the passion of learning. That's when you're, equals in the cockpit. But that's what I see is, compassion, empathy, organization, humor, a little fun. All of that keeps people going. And all of this incremental mastery is just about turning it over to that person, enabling them to succeed, and then standing back and letting them shine. What I think the critical thing that's missed is that you're proving it to them. They see it. I was reading through the CFI mentoring. We have a Facebook page that is all about CFI's mentoring. And one obviously experienced instructor was relaying how he had given his student a problem and then let him work through it. And they went to lunch, and how motivating it was for that person to see how much they actually could do by themselves without the CFI's assistance. You're proving that they're making progress because they feel like, it's hopeless and I'll never get over that wall. So if you guys want to raise a hand or question, I see a couple questions, answers, chat. Is there anything in there that we should be attending to? We have about, 7, 8 minutes left here. I got 2 more slides so we can.
Yeah, there's a question from Ollie. It says, it's a question about why ground instructor test scores have a 2-year expiration date, but the license itself has no expiration date or recurrency requirement. Does that perhaps have relevancy
That's
to
not
this
true, Ollie.
conversation?
There is a currency requirement on the ground instructor, and I think it's every year you have to do a certain amount of teach to keep it active if you want to actually execute it. Now, I can't speak for absolutely, but I was just in a seminar where that was mentioned. So don't think it lasts forever. That's probably why that is. I would think the ground instructor also, the tests expire because the knowledge changes. The FAA is finally updating questions at a kind of regular basis on all of those knowledge tests. When I went through it, and I'm sure a lot of these people that are listening and participating tonight, we knew those questions verbatim because they didn't change them for 20 years. Now they keep flushing the data banks and restoring new questions. So I think that changes. Anything else?
There's a couple other notes I'll just share here. So Paul says, what do they call a doctor who graduated last in his class? Doctor. That was back when we were
like
talking
that. That's
about
exactly. They call us
passing.
pilots.
Chuck says, so many of those things you read about what's not trained are identical to the list 20 years ago. Like so many other things, we know what needs to be taught, and yet they're still not required.
Yeah. But I got to say, I'm encouraged by what I saw with that CFI ACS, the fact that they're including items that aren't going to be tested. And that's their way of saying that, if we're doing our job correctly as CFIs, we're going way beyond the minimums. We're requiring, higher standards, and we are also exposing them to non-towered fields if we're coming from a Charlie Airport. We get them into the different environment. When I do tests, if somebody's coming from a Charlie Airport, we're going to definitely go to a non-towered field and see how they do. And believe it or not, when we test on a certain day and we go out flying, we might just encounter a crosswind. So if it's a savvy DPE, they can also see what they want to see.
One other question here. It says, if you
Yes,
renew
please.
CFI, does AGI renew as well? Did you get that?
This is a stump the stars. I really don't know the answer to that, to be honest. The AGI does not expire. I think if you're doing ground instruction as a CFI, your AGI is going to remain in effect because you're exercising the privileges. None of the ground instructor certificates expire. They just, if you have only a ground instructor certificate, you have to keep it active under that provision. And I want to say it's in the higher 61s, but that's probably wrong. But if you write a note in the chat and put your name in there, I'll get back with you, or DM me directly. I'll
Yep.
definitely get back to
Yeah,
you.
we got the name of the person who asked, and Paul
Perfect.
Spear added in the chat here 61.217 for ground instructor currency requirements. So
There you go. See?
All right, all good. Thanks
That's
so much, everybody.
okay. So this is what, God, this is what warms my heart. And I can't even remember who sent me this picture. We have done a bunch of these CFI pros at academies and colleges. And they sent me this picture of somebody testing for their CFI, and they were using the blog to demonstrate, a secondary stall, and the fact that angle of attack is invisible. I mean, that is a perfect example of what we want new and young CFIs to bring forward into the next generation. I think a lot of us see a spiraling of standards and skills, and this is what CFI Pro is designed to address and turn around. So this young lady gets a gold star, obviously. We don't have time tonight, and I didn't probably plan to do the reflective analysis. Reflective analysis is sort of part of everything we do as CFIs. We're going to talk about it. The next webinar is actually going to be on May 19th. I cannot do the May 5th because I just got assigned training in another airframe. May 5th, I'll be back in Florida doing recurrent in a different plane. I just won't be in a good state to try to deliver this. But reflective analysis is, in basic terms, what we do when we debrief largely with a student. And we want to create this habit in addition to all the other good habits that we're creating. Reflective analysis is looking back at what went on, and it's especially important to realize that what we do as humans is we are very much optimizers. If we get the job done, we tend to say, I've succeeded. If we get into the field with 1,200-foot overcast, and even though, we had a personal minimum of 1,200 works, that becomes the new normal. And that is a way that standards tend to creep. If you're familiar with Sidney Dekker, it's, what does he call it? Sliding toward failure, or tipping toward failure, whatever it is. Your standards just gradually eroding. With reflective analysis, you look back and say, did I succeed because of skill, or did I succeed because of luck? And that's what I do in every flight. On the right column in my logbook, I grade myself and say, how did I do there? This is a technique every pilot should internalize, because if we look back at what we did and grade ourselves, that brings humility into it. And it says, well, I got through that, but, I'm not sure it was all skill. If it's not all skill, it's going to fail at some point. And you see the NASA examples here, the smartest people in the world. On the second flight of the Challenger shuttles, they realized the O-rings were leaking. They kept launching. And there's a really good tape by an astronaut that flew twice on the missions from 2 to 24 and blew up on the 24th mission, because they launched too low. But they had normalized that fact that they were succeeding. They said, well, it must be working. So reflective analysis is a tool that every pilot should have. It's a tool that every CFI should build into their pilots. And we can do that largely in a comprehensive debrief. When we sit down after every flight, we take a moment, we think about it, we analyze it, and we give ourselves a grade. And the important and very rare skill there is personal honesty. I'll leave it with that. I'll see you, if you're able, on May 19th. We'll talk about reflective analysis. If you've stuck with us this long, I thank you very much. It's been great. This is the third in a series. These are all on the YouTube/Safe Pilots. They'll be up there. If you answer the questions, I will send you an additional sheet with added resources. The 19th, we'll talk about reflective analysis. I appreciate any comments you have. You can always send them back to me at davidstgeorge@gmail.com or david@safepilots. If you send it to davidstgeorge@gmail.com, spell out the saint, or it goes to my alter ego in New Zealand. So thank you all for joining tonight. Have a great eclipse tomorrow if you're in the totality zone there. I'm down in Florida, of course, so I won't see it, but thanks again. Have a great night.